And one day it came into his mind, wait a minute, those are my people that are in bondage and in slavery. And he knew within his heart that he had a destiny outside of where he was at. And so, as all of us have done at one point or another in our Christian walk, with his own understanding and the arm of his own strength, he tried to accomplish and fulfill his destiny. And what did that lead to? The wilderness. Ever been there? I bet you have. And so now he's a shepherd on the backside of the wilderness. I've talked to a lot of pastors that have had a church there. 40 years he shepherded out in the backside of the wilderness. But the book of Hebrews says that he endured as seeing him. Ooh. Now if you study some of that, you'll understand that the Bible clearly teaches Moses knew God face to face. He was the friend of God. So he spent 40 years in the wilderness just hanging out with God, talking to him face to face. That's not a bad trade-off. I've told Reshma, you know, if God gave me my choice, I'd build a nice log home way up in the mountains away from the world and just hang out with God. But he's among the people. Okay, you figure that out later. But anyway. And so here he is. He comes to a place in his wilderness ministry called Mount Horeb. Now, Mount Horeb is an interesting place. It says the Mount of God. And yet Horeb means desolation and despair. Now, how can that be the mountain of God? Quite simply, where did you meet Jesus? When you came to the end of yourself. And sometimes after you've accepted Jesus, you go back to Mount Horeb to carve your initials in that cave in Mount Horeb that Elijah hung out in. That's where Elijah ended up too after he fled from Jezebel, Mount Horeb. Desolation and despair. But here's Moses coming to Mount Horeb. And if you study, many of the patriarchs came to this place of absolute desolation and despair. Paul himself said, we despaired of life because we were overburdened. God, just take us home. Now, am I the only one in this room that's ever felt like that? Now it's not out of desolation and despair. It's out of desire. Lord, can we just go home? But I want to tell you, we all end up there. And here's Moses at this place of desolation and despair. And he sees something he's never seen before. He sees a burning fiery bush. And an angel standing next to it. He says, I'm going to go check that out. I've never seen anything like that. Well, I think I'd check it out too. A lot of people would just check out. I'm out of here. That can't be God. But there's enough of us that are curious to think, that's interesting. Well, let's face it in this hour, and I've said this 100 times if I said it once, the worst the world can do is threaten you with heaven. And if you've seen heaven, sign me up. So he comes to this place on the backside of the wilderness where he's at the end of himself. Do you know that Jesus often would go out into the wilderness to be alone with the Father? And most Christians in their Christian journey, they have decided, well, I don't like wilderness experiences. It's too tough. You've got to be kidding. That's where you meet God. When everything's comfy, cozy, and going your way, you seldom think of God. Our Christianity in America hasn't really cost us a whole bunch, but that's about to change. But here he is. And he walks up to the bush, and out of the fire, God speaks and says, Moses, take the sandals off your feet. The place you're standing is holy ground. The work of flesh, man-made shoes, is not going to step on this holy place. And so Moses had a face-to-face encounter with the God who was a consuming fire. You see, brokenness, seasons of brokenness, desolation, and despair in your life lead to a purging and a purifying of your character so that you know Him even more. That's why Paul said, I glory in trials, tests, and tribulations. Not because he got hit by too many rocks, like I used to think, but because it brought great intimacy between he and God. And the more that he was... See, Isaiah says, a broken and a contrite spirit I will in no way despise. Until there's at least a measure of brokenness in your life, you're going to stumble and fall. And the more of the anointing you have without brokenness, guess what? The more disaster is about to happen. Because God's after a platform of character. He wants character. And brokenness leads to character. Tests and trials in your life, I shared last night, they lead to character. It's not to put you under, it's to cause you to rise above. And so he has an encounter with the God who is a consuming fire. It changed his life. What I find fascinating is after he had been in the courts of Pharaoh, eloquent, taught, in all their wisdom, now God says, go back to Egypt and bring out my people. He says, I don't know how to speak. What he was saying is, Lord, what I thought I had, what I thought I knew, the strength that used to be mine in the flesh accounts for nothing. What he was saying is, Lord, I really don't know how to be led of your Spirit right now because I'm not relying on the flesh anymore. And God said, let me help you. What do you have in your hand? See, Christian, we always make excuses why we're not doing something for God. We've invited a number. I took 43 people one time on a missions trip to Fiji. Let me say this. I recommend you never do that. Keep it to about 10. But anyway, I took 43 people. And interesting, some of the young people, they're new. What was the program they were in? Master's Commission kids. They were the best. I'd take them anywhere. But there were 11 of them, and they were making a decision whether they were supposed to go or not. So I'd ask them about a week into the process, well, what do you think? They said, we're praying. I said, well, what are you praying about? They said, the finances. I said, stop that right now. What you need to find out is it God's will for you to go? When that's established, the finances will come. But if you're praying about finances, let me tell you, you're praying in the wrong direction. And see, we always put the cart before the horse. God doesn't say if you have the finances, go, because there's no faith involved. What you need to do is find out what his will is and then move in that direction. God will always meet you there. I want to tell you, anytime we've traveled around the world over the last 10, 12 years, not once did I have the finances to go. But when I heard God, I said, yes, I'm coming. And he's taught me when you give your word, you keep it. If you have to swim, walk, or do whatever, you're going to get there. And you know what? Every single time he's met the need. So this God who is a consuming fire has an appointment in your life once, twice, maybe many times. Most of us, it's many times. And then we see in Exodus 24, this verse 15. It says, Moses went up into the mount, and a cloud covered the mount, and the glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the seventh day he called unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Oh, I like that. I got to explain this. I always have to throw in this plug. 2 Peter 3:8 says a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. So we can go back historically from Jesus 4,000 years to Adam. From Adam until the turn of the century, we have now completed 6,000 years, and it's early in the morning on the seventh day. On the seventh day, God spoke to Moses from out of the cloud and said, come up here. Remember, type, symbol. God is speaking to his people right now. It's time to come into the glory. But you're not going to get there by way of the cloud. You have to come first, have an encounter with a God who's a consuming fire. And let me show you this. This is fun. Verse 17 said, the sight of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the eyes of the children of Israel. But to Moses, it was a cloud. Ooh, that's interesting. To Moses, who'd already had an encounter with God who was the consuming fire, he sees it as a cloud. We just had a conference I shared last night, and one of the speakers was Brother Dean Braxton, who was clinically dead for an hour and 45 minutes. And somebody asked him one time, he said, Brother Braxton, he said, what does the throne of God look like? And he said, are you kidding me? When you're in the throne room of God, you're not looking at the throne. I went, come on, that's so true. He said, but I'll tell you what it was, because you know everything. I mean, it's just imparted into you. He said the throne that God was sitting on, some people say, well, it's like quartz, or it's like this kind. He said it was a cloud of glory. Now you think about this. Jesus went up in a cloud. He was already seated on his throne. The Lord is returning in a cloud to rule and reign. That's good stuff.